regularly recorded. Of the 29 that are regularly recorded in the wild, we have good evidence that 24 of them are breeding. That doesn't mean that all 24 could be properly called naturalized, because there are different definitions that people will use to say that it's naturalized. Is the population self-sustaining? Is it independent of human activity, etc.? So we have very good evidence that 24 species are now breeding. Of the 29 that are regularly seen in the wild that are not breeding, there's just 5 of those as shown here. Now, you're not supposed to be able to read this graph. I'm only showing this to you because of the 29 species that we show, the middle column just shows you how many states there is evidence that the birds are breeding, and the right column just shows you how many states where they are regularly seen. So the 2 species that are seen most frequently, the budgerigar and the monk parakeet, are now seen in at least 36 to 37 states, which is unusual because the budgie isn't breeding here. But so many of them escape captivity that they're regularly seen in very large numbers, but it's one of the interesting cases where it's no longer breeding. The 4 most common breeding species that are clearly very well established and are clearly established populations and can easily be called naturalized. And for most of those, the populations are growing. For the monk parakeet, the red crowns, the Mandé condor, and the yellow chevron parakeet. I'm going to explain this graph, and then I'm going to explain why this graph is incorrect or is erroneous. So I had an undergraduate student do a senior thesis, and we're modifying this and changing it for publication. We did a species distribution model of where those 4 common species are in the United States, and we overlaid a map of their distribution with these GIS maps of vegetation density and population density and mean annual income. And so this looks at the various factors for each of those 4 species, what are so important. So clearly temperature is really important. Most of the species are in the south. And then for different species, shrubland cover, forest land cover, planted or cultivated land is most important if once you take temperature out of the question or out of the analysis. So however interesting these are to look at, that it's completely an incorrect way to look at why parrots are where they are. The reason is that most of the parrots are in Florida and in Texas and in Los Angeles, not because they had the opportunity to settle anywhere, and they settled in those areas because the habitat was the best for them. It's because Miami and Dallas and Los Angeles are the 3 largest importation spots for imported wildlife. So if a bird is going to escape captivity, or the density of pet owners, bird pet owners, is the highest in those areas, that's where those species originated. So the point is we're redoing this analysis specific for Southern California, specific for Texas, specific for Florida. So species distribution models are fantastic, but for parrots in the United States, where their distribution is not independent of where they were imported or not independent activity, I don't think a continent-wide or a country-wide analysis is correct. So I want to move fairly quickly. I don't want to run out of too much time. I want to talk about 3 aspects: population growth, impacts, and controversy. We know about population growth best for 2 species, the budgerigar and the monk parakeet. Budgerigar was the single most common species of parrot in the United States in the 1970s, and now it's basically extinct as a breeding species. Why? Because house sparrows came into Florida in the 1970s, and house sparrows kicked out all of the budgerigars that were breeding in all of the nest boxes in Florida. So this species went from a population of approximately 25,000 to basically 10 or 15 breeding birds in 20 years because of house sparrows. The monkey, the most widely distributed species, has been so successful in the United States because of 2 aspects. It builds its own nest, and it has a completely variable diet, so that in Chicago during the coldest winter months, the only food that it has available to it is seed from backyard bird feeders. So monk parakeets in Chicago are 100% dependent on humans providing seed during the coldest months of the year. And I've published and hypothesized that if it wasn't for humans, monk parakeets would not be in Chicago. Now, monk parakeets exhibit a general trend for many introduced species. For 30 years, the species showed exponential population growth, and then in 2005, the population crashed. And the population crashed everywhere in the United States except Texas. Really interesting, but even more interesting is that it crashed in New York 5 years before it crashed in Connecticut and in Florida and Chicago. And the New York population has no genetic contact with the birds in Florida or Connecticut. It probably has contact with Connecticut or Florida or Chicago. That's exactly the same pattern that happened to the corvids with West Nile virus. The corvids in New York crashed about 5 years before the corvids in the Midwest. We have absolutely no evidence what caused the crash in monk parakeets, but it has been suggested that it's some disease as yet unidentified. Now, amazingly, despite the fact that the population has crashed, the number of localities where monk parakeets are seen continue to increase. So a range expansion coupled with a population decrease. How is that possible? Again, just more evidence that the population range is expanding. We have hypothesized and published a paper suggesting that these divergent trends of a range expansion with a population decrease is because the birds are changing their biology now that they've been here for 30 years. And what I mean when I say that is that we think they're dispersing and they're living in smaller groups rather than large concentrations, which you typically see of monk parakeets. So just in the Chicago region over a 10-year period, we had approximately 12 locations where monk parakeets were located. 10 years later, we had, I think, 83 locations where monk parakeets were located. So complete exodus of the Hyde Park region in Chicago for more rural and more suburban regions. We know the best evidence for the impacts of parrots in the United States for the monk parakeets. What the label that you use for a species depends upon how you define them. In the United States, the two most important terms are an agricultural pest or a nuisance species, depending upon whether they're eating crops or whether they're just causing economic damage. Is the monk parakeet an agricultural pest? Yes, it is in its native range. In the United States, it's only an agricultural pest in southern Florida where it nests close to tropical fruit orchards. So it's a localized agricultural pest, but it's not a widespread agricultural pest. But it's an incredible economic nuisance species everywhere that it's common, and it's a nuisance species because it causes economic damage to electrical utility and transmission everywhere that it is common, meaning Texas, Florida, California, Connecticut, et cetera, in Chicago. This is just a scene of a power transmission in Florida. Most of the nests in Florida are on man-made structures. On average, during the time that this was monitored in Florida, approximately every 1.5 days, there is a power outage due to a monk parakeet nest. So the Florida Power and Light, the utility company, spends probably $300,000 to $400,000 a year removing monk parakeets from nesting structures. So with respect to, so again, I'm only talking about one of the 25 breeding species in the United States, but we know the most about it. So what can we say about it? It's definitely introduced. Of course, it's non-native. It's definitely naturalized. It's expanding its range. It's a localized agricultural pest, and it's absolutely an economic nuisance species to utility companies. But the controversy, many people love it. And so many people love it that they're trying to change the laws in some states to get the monk parakeet protected status as if it was a native species. So in New Hampshire, they've changed the law so that you can now have it as a pet. In Connecticut, they're trying to change, some people are trying to change the law so that utility companies can't take down the nests, which seems really odd if it's causing a power outage. And in New York, they've actually introduced a bill that has not yet passed called the Monk Parakeet Protection Act, which would give this species the same status as any other native wild species. So, and so there's an enormous controversy, not just, I'm just highlighting this about monk parakeets, because monk parakeets are in the face of public and utility companies more than most species. But the controversy and the oddity of monk parakeet goes well beyond almost to the absurd. So if you want to build a monk parakeet nest and attract them, there's a website that can tell you how to do that. If you want to spend money to see a monk parakeet, you can fly to Brooklyn or drive to Brooklyn and get on a monk parakeet safari. So, in brief, monk parakeets also, but parrots are now well established in the United States as they are contiguous United States, as they are very much in Hawaii, and as they very much are in Puerto Rico as well. I believe that the range expansion is going to continue to increase and that the population numbers will increase. Most or all of the populations are dependent on human activity, like bird feeding or human modification of the landscape. And interestingly, many of the species are now exhibiting their own population demography, population fluctuations that are unique to the North America, not perhaps unique to introduced or invasive species. And a lot of these interesting patterns we don't really know the cause of. But I don't know how many students are here, but one of the things I'm really trying to emphasize is parrots in the United States are an absolute gold mine that has completely been untapped, unapproached in terms of research opportunities and interesting questions that one could ask. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Francie.
You said the thick-billed and the Carolina parakeet were shot out.
Yes.
Why?
We don't know. I mean, well, people were shooting pretty much everything back then. Passenger pigeon was shot for food. We believe the Carolina parakeet was mostly shot because it would eat grains and it was semi-tame around humans and it would come into gardens and fruit crops, and I think people thought that it was a pest, so they just shot it out. The official record says it went extinct in the wild in 1914, but there's really good evidence that there were small populations forward into the 1930s. The ironic thing is the last bird in captivity died in 1918 in exactly the same cage, aviary, at the Cincinnati Zoo that the last passenger pigeon died in. So a horrible situation. That's there. Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much for your talk. Regarding the increase in number of locations where parrots are seen across America, do you think this might have something to do with the increase in number of bird watchers? Because in Eastern Europe, we've seen this correlation with many bird species.
I don't deny that possibility. I don't deny it at all. On the other hand, parrots are such a unique bird in the United States. For example, in Washington State, there's been an increase in the number of locations. That's not because there are more bird watchers in Washington State. Because if you see an exotic parrot in the U.S., you're much more likely to report it. So, but I don't doubt that. Sorry, one last question, and then I'm happy to. Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay. Yes.
I'm wondering about the effect of these introduced parrots on native species.
Yes, I did not have a chance to speak to that. There have been two studies, one published, one unpublished, and to date, monk parakeets have not been shown to have any negative effect on any native species in the United States. Joanna Berger published a paper on this issue that monk parakeets will interact with house sparrows and mourning doves and other species of bird feeders. Christopher Appelt in Chicago has unpublished data looking at abundance and species diversity and abundance of native birds at bird feeders, whether there are or are not monk parakeets, and they've not shown any effect. But as an example of a fantastic research project that could be done now within Citizen Science Database in the United States, there's what's called Project Feeder Watch. Project Feeder Watch, if you could figure out how to do the statistics, you could look at feeder watch data in areas where there were or were not monk parakeets. And I'm just waiting to find a student who wants to do that project that I think would be really fascinating.
Mutations surviving of these normal other ones, like the natural green, or the blues getting with the yellows getting with these flocks?
In monk parakeet?
Yeah.
there has been genetic studies of monk parakeets across the United States, and they have identified which subspecies from the native range are here. I can't remember exactly which of the subspecies are here, but pretty much now it's pretty much a genetic melting pot across the United States. One last question.
Well, I was just interested in the crash of monk parrots in 2000 and early 2000,
Yeah,
which coincides with the global crash in house sparrows.
you're absolutely right. I had not realized that. But it's approximately the same time.
And I do wonder if one thing that's occurred to me is, has there been a change in the way the sort of seed that is produced, commercial seed that's used
Excellent question. I don't know. One could look into that, but I honestly don't know. But it's an interesting idea. But we thought that it was headed to extinction, but after 2 years, it sort of leveled off at about a third of the previous population, and now they're stable, but they're slowly increasing despite the range.
sparrows in many places just drop right out.
I know, yeah, that's really dramatic. Even in Chicago,
That's all coming out.
great.
All right. So I'm Roland Jonker. I speak to you today about a more global view on urban parrots, and I am with City Parrots, and at City Parrots we try to conserve urban parrots, and we try to conserve parrots by putting them in more urban environments, and I'll explain more of that later. So when I was given the opportunity to present here a couple of months ago, I was wondering what I'll kind of talk about. Would I talk about these, my first love in parrots, these pair of scarlet macaws that I've been tracking together with my partner Grace for 4 to 4 years. They were breeding, actually fledgling chicks as well. They had a lot of poaching going on there. Or would I talk about my my anger and my disappointment with a lot of the research done around the Mediterranean, where well, we probably will not talk about that in this presentation, but if you're interested, and I'm up for a coffee and talk about that after the presentation. And I could also talk about my crash of the presentation that I experienced last week, and total panic since then. Managed to get something up. If anyone in the room sees a few of his pictures and I'm not acknowledging them, I do apologize, and thank you for your help. What I really want to talk about is that I think we should reintroduce parrots to cities in their native range, and that's basically what I'm building up to. I thought I start with that, and then but I'll first go into a bit of my actual research, which is limited, but it's been done. Parkiet op nummer is Dutch for parakeet on number, and it's something like a house number of we have tagged about 400 individuals of a 1,200 sized population in my hometown of Leiden in the Netherlands. And we did that to find out if these parakeets are cuddly, funny denizens of the sky that so many of us are enjoying, or are they more like the monsters that some of the more eco-xenophobic people have started to make them up to be. And my central question in that research is, are they invasive? And we see that the ringneck parakeets are very urban, and the question is there: can you really call a species invasive if they're not present in any native habitat or native niche in the new environment. So that was my question. And this is a bit of an introduction of ring-necked parakeets that we have in the Netherlands. The scientific name, their origin is the Indian subcontinent. A lot of people, a lot of newspapers always try to fit in Africa in there. There's very little evidence that the African subspecies has contributed to the current populations in the Netherlands or Europe, as that United States might be very different. First breeding in 1968 in The Hague, so we're celebrating the 50-year anniversary of the ring-necked parakeet in the Netherlands. They're predominantly, I could say exclusively, urban. And in 2011, which was the last opportunity for us to do communal roost counts and synchronically over the whole nation, because we haven't had a growth of a lot of roost sites, and not so many people wanted to or are able to count them. So at that point we had 12,000, and we do think that the population is not growing that much anymore, and has, especially in the core populations in The Hague and in Amsterdam, have reached their maximum density. So what I do, we catch, if you're interested in that, I have a very effective trap where we catch 73 of these birds in one morning. We take them out, lose some fingers, and but we were able to tag them and do also kind of measurements. And I like to acknowledge a lot of the students that have been helping us with that, because it takes about 15 minutes to process a parakeet, and it's a bit of a hassle, but it's intense work. So I in my results, I'd like to learn something about their longevity, and the thing is that they likely live longer than a usual PhD assignment, and so this is a problem in modern science. And so I don't have enough data to present you. Well, what we see is that a lot of the birds die quite young. Mortality is quite big within in youth, and what we see several birds that are getting quite old. So, but I think on average it will be 1 or 2 breeding cycles. I'm gonna switch over to the disease. We did a few testing on that, and this is why I'm so disappointed with my colleagues in the Mediterranean. We did find parrot disease. Familiar with people familiar with parrots know how important that is, how big a problem that can be. But we did not find silicosis. So you can go into the park and have a stroll there without in danger of attracting silicosis. And I'll go into more detail on that dispersal. Leiden is in the center of that circle. That's where I live. And that's where I catch and release my parakeets, and it's actually right in my backyard. And to Haarlem, which is up in the north there, it's about 35 kilometers. And we got the people through observation.org, it's our eBird in the Netherlands. We got reports back from Haarlem, from Rotterdam, and also in the vicinity of Amsterdam. So that means they can disperse, especially young birds, up to 35 kilometers. And this means that the roosts that are we have several different founder populations in The Hague, in Amsterdam, and those are now all connected and exchanging genes probably, because they're breeding over there. And so I was thinking, how are these ring-necked parrots taking over the world? at the moment. So in 50 years, let's say that's every 4 years we have a new generation, which is actually a bit slow. That will make 12 generations, 35 kilometers per generation. Will have this circle on the map. And so our Dutch parakeets should be in London, reaching Denmark, connecting with the parakeets in Germany and Brussels and even Paris. But the actual heat map that we're having is quite different. This is a cumulative map of observations. It's not individuals. So this dot over here, so where I'm born in Eindhoven, those are 7 birds who have been put in observation a lot of times. And in Amsterdam and the Hague area, we have roosts with up to 5,000 birds in there. What this does show is that how restrict their distribution stays to our Western co-urbanization, where all the people in the Netherlands live, and how hard they have it in 50 years to get out of those urban areas. And I found this animated GIF on the web, and it's about another invasive, the Eurasian collared dove, which has been made landfall in Florida in 1984. So that's about half the time the ringers have been present in the Netherlands, and this goes up to 2007, I think, something like that. It has reached Alaska, and it's all over the place in North America, and it's getting into South America as well. So it's a very different pattern. So I conclude from this that there's very little worry about, and there's other things that make me think that about ringer parakeets having an effect on. So let's talk. What I really wanted to talk about is, and that's the diversity. Kick back. These are all pictures. You have some beautiful captures here, and Stephen was talking about the lack of fishery lovebirds in the United States, but they are breeding in France. Tarantara lovebird is in its native area in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and the rest are indeed in the United States. These are Singapore, and in India and in the Philippines, the Bulbocitus, I don't know how to say it correctly, is observed not too often, but they are in the Manila area, and we know very little of that species, but it's surprising that it's in the cities. Macaws in South America are plentiful in urban areas. Medellin, Caracas, of course, with blue and gold, and there's some green wings as well in Brazil and cities in the south. The Psittacara species, which were in Arahinga up to recently, almost all species except for the one that needs a range expansion, that's the Cuban parakeet, have been known to breed and exist in the cities. All these former Arahingas are also in cities. These present Arahingas are now well established in cities in South America, and a few in, of course, Lendes in the United States as well. These are well known in the Caribbean too, in Kingston, of course, and in Williamstown, in Curaçao. We have a small population in Bahia Blanca, if I'm not mistaken. It's in Argentina, of the burrowing parrot, and I've seen the Eligrius macaw in Rio de Janeiro myself, and also the hound macaw, the red-shouldered. Bermuda species are very difficult to establish in cities, but 2 populations have started. The gray cats is a new addition last week. Somebody told me there are plenty in Sucre, and of course the ubiquitous parakeets. Forepaws are in several cities, as long as in South America, and are probably missing one or two species. People here will hear from Greek later today. Amazon species are plentiful in cities. Yellowneck are now in Guatemala City, and I'm starting to build up a population there, and I'm really happy with that, as it is a threatened taxon. Also, many of the Caribbean threatened taxons are now present in cities. The Cuban, for example, has several subspecies of them in the Bahamas and also in La Habana, Cuba. These will be covered by Brooke, but it's about fair to say that many of these species are now more plentiful in the United States than in their native Mexico. The protégé species, many of them in the United States, but also in Manaus and in Guayaquil in Ecuador, there's native parrots. These in the native ranges, they occur in cities and have quite a sizable population there. These old balls, Bionis, former Amazon, and these parrotlets, I had the great fortune to see the brown-back parrotlet in Rio de Janeiro Botanical Garden last year, and it's funny that that bird, which wasn't photographed only 10 years ago for the first time, or something like that. So we're really happy to see that bird. We jump over to the Eurasian part of the world. We'll hear talk about the lesser silver-crested cockatoo, of course. Some salmon-crested and cockatoo alba are surviving in cities, not the biggest populations, but the greatest silver-crested cockatoo, I never have to explain myself to Australians. They know parrots plentiful in their cities. Parrots, of course, and I'm very happy to hear that the Philippine cockatoo, the red-fended parrot here, is making some work of getting into the city of Palawan. So it's encouraging. These are, of course, plentiful, and we had a poster presentation yesterday of, you can make a question there, of some of these cockatoos coming into and becoming more important in the cities. Budgies probably have one extinct in Florida, but there are some in Walvis Bay in Namibia, and there's a small population, but they're not flourishing. Other lorikeets in Australia, these lorikeets in Australia. All these rosellas, I think Johanna can confirm, and all these other interesting parakeets in Australia. Now we're in New Zealand, where the kaka have been introduced into Wellington in the fenced area, and they have responded amazingly. So that's one of the most important populations now there. And kakariki are following them. It's not very sure, but they are seen in Wellington in some numbers now. The specular species, which are ubiquitous now, of course, living at parakeets, Alexandrines we get in the Netherlands, many of them in India and of course Singapore. And I'm very happy to report that the Lord Derby parakeet has been established somewhere in Lhasa in Tibet. That's in that native range. That's a great range extension for them. These old balls, we'll have a discussion about that, but we see King Williamsburg, I'm saying that correctly, we see a lot of Cape parrots, African greys are in Uganda in urban areas, so it is possible for them to, but they probably need that palm nut that it's eating. Senegal parrots in Lisbon and a small city on Borneo that has the new names. So that's 114 species of parrots that have established different sized populations in cities. a huge diversity, in my opinion. There's a lot of species that have ecological similar needs that we could think of that would also be possible to introduce into the cities. And I'll go into that a bit later. They usually have large and stable populations, and part of their success is, I think, is in the limiting of agricultural conflict. I do get ringneck parakeets eating my pear tree barren, but I don't have to live all those produce. So I gladly let them, and I still have too many pears left, and I have to share with my neighbors. So, and there's a limited opportunity for nest poaching. You just can't go into people's backyards or cut down a tree in an urban park to get to the chicks. So that's, and what I think is very important, I got a friend killed last year in Colombia. He was trying to keep up a nature reserve for a hummingbird. But these urban parrots don't need a lot of support. They don't need guarding. They don't need a reserve. They are independent, and they don't depend on our goodwill for survival. And I think that's a very big plus. All these parrots, many of those, result only go into cities because they're introduced, and that's usually the modus operandi, how they get there and how they change their culture from a wild forest bird or a savanna bird to an urban culture. And so we can hope for some of these birds to conquer and colonize cities, but it's actually often quite necessary to do introductions. So I like to talk to you about the resistance, and I hope you join them. We have most of the urban parrot population are ringneck parakeets and monk parakeets, which from a conservation perspective are not that interesting. And so I would like to some of the cities within a native range have more interesting populations, like the cliff parakeet could be in Sucre. It's very close to that city. Cochabamba, La Paz maybe as well, but I fear that the monk parakeet will, because it's traded far and deep from Argentina, will conquer these cities before that, and that should be a priority. In southern Brazil, we see a lot of blue-front Amazons, Curitiba, Joinville, in Sao Paulo. There's many of them, and the more appropriate species would have been one that needs some range extension. That's the red-tailed Amazon. There is going to be a poster or presentation about the burrowing parrot later on. It's very close to Santiago. It's basically their habitat, and we know they do well in the city, so I really would like that species. And there's a lot of moon parakeets there now who need some competition. So something I, and in the Australian region, in Perth, there were. I would point out that there's only 17 birds in 20 years ago, and actually the long-billed corella is introduced there now, and it's the most plentiful there, where the western corella would be more appropriate. I Mark and Maria not here. That's a pity. I did a poster presentation in LA 11 years ago, and I put these three possible things for a project up. And since then, we learned that Puerto Rican Amazon is actually joining the introduced population of Amazon on Puerto Rico and learning to new habitats, but they have had the setback with Maria. And I also mentioned the golden conure in that poster. And I can now proudly present that 150 species of golden conure has recently been reintroduced in Belém. It's a city in the mouth of the Amazon. It's 1.5 million people, and it's some pictures of it. And they actually have bred already. 1 month after their reproduction, they started breeding, and they have fledged one fledgling. So that's a really huge success in that sense. Thanks to the Livingstone Foundation and the chairman. And I want to conclude with all people here in the audience and the speakers. I really would like to be writing a book together, doing some chapters together, and get a different perspective on urban parrots out than as an invasive species. And I look forward to working with you. Questions?
For most of these species, do you see them willing to engage in hetero-specific flocks, or do they stick with their own?
Oh, that's an interesting question. What we find is that single escapees, if they're of the flocking kind, not all parrots are. So we see single Amazons in The Hague joining ring-necked parakeet flocks, especially when they're wild caught. It doesn't happen a lot. And we had, with the introduction of Alexandrines into places where ring-necked parakeets were already established, they would join those flocks for a while, and they would later on split and get their own roosts and sometimes disappear from sight. That's the dynamic.
Of those 150 species mentioned, how many would you say pose some level of risk of hybridization?
Hybridization does occur. I don't know if that's a risk. That's what we have Alexandrine parakeets. There's a very extreme case in Germany where one female bred with ring-necked parakeets and started breeding with her own offspring, and something very similar to Alexandrine parakeets that came from that. And she later, that population later integrated more Alexandrines. So it's the purity of the bloodlines is something that we should look into, and we don't need to do ridiculous things. We need to be sensible about this, but I think in most cases this is a minor issue. Some hybrids in Brazil, some hybrids in California, but I don't think they have a real big stand on the population.
One last question.
Yep.
Have there been any like city assessments in terms of like size of trees or amount of food that you need to determine the suitability of it prior to release?
Well, there are so many cities that have urban parrot population now that's a good guesswork. So I would love to have that, but I don't think it's very necessary. So usually you see them in where there's high rise and urban parks, and I think also these diplomat barrows where all the big gardens are. So, but usually they are quite good at that. There's some big flexibility for and 70% of much of the diet, 70% of the diet comes from people in the ring cakes. So there's peanuts, sunflowers, set up. So yeah, that's the last question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Brendan. Next up is Michael Braun from Heidelberg.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So I have to move on quite quickly because I have some things to tell. Well, there are some co-authors of this talk because many people have contributed, like kind of roost counts or something like that. And I want to tell you a little bit about the strategies and population development of the parrot species established in urban habitats in Europe. So we'll move on. This is the overview of my talk. I will talk first a little bit about the parrots population, so an overview, then the population development of the ringneck parakeet, the reproduction of ringneck parakeets in Europe, the limits of the distribution and the adaptations in Europe, competition of parrots with native and non-native species, and if I have time, phylogeny and taxonomy. So this is the ringneck parakeet, which is the most common species in Europe. It's like Vern already said, from India, from the Indian subcontinent to Pakistan. A natural distribution is here in Asia and here in Africa, as you can also see in the handbook of the birds of the world. See the heat maps of the handbook, you can see that there's a big spot in Europe. So something has changed. So this is from Livius publication here. The biggest populations are not found in the southern Europe, but in Central and Western Europe. You see that they are quite they're restricted to the more or less to the urban areas, as William already said. This is the breeding population in Germany. You can see that there are these red and orange confirmed breedings, and the blue dots are just escapes. Furthermore, we have the Alexandrian parakeets, which came later in the 1980s than the ringneck parakeets, so their distribution is more limited still, but their populations are growing. The yellow-headed Amazon is a special thing for Johanna, so it's probably not my thing. So she could tell you much more on the yellow-headed parrots in Stuttgart. So there's also one blue-fronted Amazon Stuttgart, which contributed to her, I think this is she, genetics to the whole population, which is not a fortune. So then we have the mock parakeets in Europe, where there's no breeding population in Germany. And these are parrots which have bred at least once in Germany. And there's one species missing, which is the Carolina parakeet. The story of the Carolina parakeet is based on that person, Fryer von Berlepsch, and he lived in the 19th century until 1933. And he made up, he was the founder of this ornithological station in Thuringia in Germany. And he kept, as an apiculturist, he kept Carolina parakeets in the 1870s. And some of them escaped. And one survived at liberty, and so he put more birds outside, and they started to breed outside the aviary, and they started to build up a population with more than 20 birds. But what happened is, like, unfortunately, the same story as in the native range. So these 20 birds, they flocked together, they went for a flock around, and they flew up to 50 kilometers away. 50 kilometers away, all of the birds were shot by a single person, and it was a host. And he shot all of the birds in only 2 days. So unfortunately, was at the beginning of the breeding population of this species in Europe, it was also extirpated by man. But we have still plenty of them in the sea. So I will talk about the surviving parrots in Europe, which is ringneck parakeet at first. So the population started to establish themselves during the 1960s and 70s in 10 European countries. And this is also a Livius paper, where you can see the population rise, which is quite an exponential growth since the 1970s. Especially since the 2000s, there has been a large increase in population size, but not in the range size. We've done a whole census in Germany last year, and we've totaled about 14,000 of these birds in Germany only. So there's an annual increase of parakeets in Germany, the ringneck parakeets. How about the reproduction? The breeding cycle of this tropical species is not in summer as we would expect. It is winter, late winter, January and February. They start occupying the nests, and in March and April they are laying basically their eggs, and in April to June they will raise the chicks. So it's all in the first half of the year, not in the summer. The summer, you see, the summer starts here in June. So at the beginning of summer, they have already finished their brood. So it's quite surprising that a species, tropical species, can survive such a climate. But where do they breed? They breed in monoplane trees, like here. But more is, I worked in Heidelberg, and there are a lot of buildings and fewer old trees. So why they shifted to these things? So they breed in different kinds of holes at buildings, like facade holes, nest boxes, thermal insulation, metal pipe. This is all in a diameter of 50 meters. So all at the same place. And I was very surprised finding that they also were able to breed in these metal pipes, which become quite hot in summer. This is concrete slabs. So, but the more interesting thing about these buildings in Germany is the thermal insulation. What happens at these buildings? Because Germany gets quite cold in winter, like here in Vancouver, probably a little bit colder, and then you have woodpeckers making holes in this thermal insulation. Quite common thing in Europe. But if they are parakeets, they will start looking at these woodpecker holes, which are quite narrow. They are not deep. But as soon as the parakeets arrive, damage gets larger, and parakeet numbers become more numerous. So this is what happens. They breed inside this styrofoam layer of only 8 centimeters width. So this is very, very narrow, but it's enough for them. And this styrofoam layer is very has thermal advantage compared to other natural cavities. So they do quite well. What we did is provided some nest boxes with styrofoam and without styrofoam, and these these holes in these walls can make up to like that size of a square meter, or more than 150 centimeters long. So they are really digging inside this facade, and there needs to be a solution to be done. And whether you can eradicate parakeets, this is sometimes, but I did not like this possibility. I thought the nest boxes could be a much more convenient way of solving that problem, but the parakeets didn't like nest boxes. They didn't know what to do with that. They tried to enter the old nests and enlarged the old cavity. So there was only a little bit left, but the female enlarged the nest in order to get to the old nest. And did not show any interest in the nest box. She didn't know what to do with it. And after the entrance was closed, she became interested, and that's what happened. So she took over the nest and laid a clutch of 4 eggs. So this was successful. And I did some studies on the development of the ringneck parakeets, which are quite interesting, but I cannot go into much detail here. This is just one of the graphs of the publication, and they start growing, and they have their highest body mass at about 30 days, and they fledge at about 50 days of age. Breeding success changes with age of the female. So the younger females, they have about 2 fledglings, and during the following broods, the breeding success rises. So the older females are getting more offspring than the younger females. What are the limits of the distribution? So the constraint of the distribution of parrots in Europe, and what are the adaptations? This is the difference to the. So if we can see the temperatures in Germany, you can see the 0-degree isotherm in January, so which means it's frost. Basically, east of that line, so to the right, there is always frost in January, and to the western part, there's sometimes frost. So what you can tell is that all the populations to the west, they have been thriving, so they are successful. But the population east of them, which were breeding, 7 individuals, 32 individuals, or in Austria here, 70 individuals, quite large, but they all became extinct over time. While the other populations along the Rhine Valley in the warm climate, they were thriving and doing But even in Heidelberg, there's snow in the winter. What happens in winter? In winter, like in Austria, population, you can have big temperatures like minus 20 degrees and even colder. But despite that extreme year values, the population survived over 30 years with a maximum of 70 individuals, which we would consider an established population. But the population crashed after the roosting site at a Congress center, like here, was sealed. So the heating was, they needed that heating. After that, they just. So this is like a paradox in winter in Germany. And here you see the problem they are facing, the frostbite, because they're missing toes and claws. So in the nesting, you don't see any frostbite. This is true because they are, but in the older individuals, you see that the foods are getting smaller. So this is a 1-year-old female and an old male. So it's quite impressive what happens to those birds. And you would say, well, they're probably not surviving, but they are doing. And how many of them are suffering from frostbite? Which toes are suffering from frostbite? Nearly 70% of the adults are suffering from frostbite, and it's mainly in the longer toes, so in the long front and the hind toe. So only 30% are not suffering. And here you can see the with claws, so she can only use the right foot in order to get into her nest. So what are the consequences? Some female, so there was an observation that a female needed 80 trials to enter a nest successfully in a tree. So extremely high energy demand. And a female ringed parakeet slipped from a branch during copulation, so there's no chance of fertilization. And while in the ringed parakeet, you have this high degree of frostbite. In the Alexandrine parakeet, it was not observed in 1995, but I think, but now it seems to appear. We have had, you've seen that picture, but what happens to the fertilized eggs? In this case, they did not hatch any, not even one egg hatch. The reason was that there was not enough styrofoam left, so it was cold outside, and as soon as the female leaves the nest for 15 minutes, the eggs will cool down too fast, so the heat is not remaining in this kind of nest box, in this horizontal one. That's why I would use that vertical box later. And you can see that in UK, 2 out of 4 eggs do not hatch. Here it's called infertility, which is not true, but 4 out of 50% of the eggs do not hatch, while in the native range they do hatch to much higher extent. So there's a loss of broods in Germany, but how many? 38% of the eggs do not hatch. In Israel, it's also introduced, but it's a warmer climate, 70% of the eggs do not hatch, so it's only the half of them. In Germany, 1/3 of all pairs do not produce any fledgling. In Israel, it's 70%. So it's much higher extent of pairs are unsuccessful. In Germany, the mortality in the nest is 15%, while in India it's 28%. So there's kind of nearly no mortality in the nest, very low. So how is the survival of these birds? Usually we say that they are long-lived. They can live up to 50 years in captivity, but what is their survival in wild here in Europe, in Germany? It can be high, 80%, but it can be very low. Some years, so it changes. And the mean survival of the females was 75%, but the lowest value, as you've seen, is only 40%, which is really, really high, low survival rate. The reasons are unknown, probably the winter or predator, because there was a goshawk preying upon that population. And we know it's important for a female to get old, to produce more fledglings. So it's important for the population growth. And the nest sites also have a high degree of reuse, so the female is going to use the nest site every year. Also important is the timing, which is a constraint on the invasion success. Why? Because in India, as you see in the native range, in southern India, they breed much earlier than in northern India. But you see, even at the latitude of 50 degrees in Germany, they breed at the same time as in Northern India, but the climate is totally different. So they breed much earlier than expected by latitude, and they also breed much earlier than expected when compared to native species in Europe. The European native species breed early in southern Europe than in Central Europe, but the parakeets nearly breed at the same time. So this is a constraint. It's very, very highly conserved breeding season. What else is an adaptation is that the morphology changes. So this was from a study and a publication. So they're changing their morphology. So they are evolving within very few generations, kind of 10 generations. And this is one of the very few studies showing that morphology in the introduced population is changing very fast. And here's the bill shape. So we have these Asian forms. We don't have any of the African subspecies here in Europe. So we have this Asian form, and you can see that this is the native range of Asia, and their morphology is not a phylogenetic tree, it's morphospace. Their morphology changed, kind of similar to the African. So what happens to the ringed parakeets in Europe? They get longer wings, longer scalps, wider beaks, larger and stronger beaks. So this is possibly adaptation to colder climate and drier food, because they don't have that soft food in winter. So they have drier food and kind of rapid evolution. So how about competition? We were talking about that. We had that study in 2011 where we compared the occurrence of ringed parakeets and starlings in the nesting sites in Germany. You can see that tree species, when you look at the tree species, that the ringed parakeet is really, really half of them, more than half of them are breeding in the London plane, which is an ornamental tree. And in the native Pseudoplatanus, there was not even one. They did not breed in that tree species. But starlings, what to say? The number. So that there was no competition, because they have was reduced competition because starlings breed in smaller trees and the rabbits in larger trees. So the roosting site of the Alexandrians was shared between Psittacula patra and stockdoves. And long-term observations say that the tree holes increased 300%, and native stockdoves are not negatively affected by the parakeets. But there is a competition between the parakeets because the large Alexandrian moves out the smaller ringed. Nutheads may take over ringed parakeet nest. This is not published yet, but it should be published, that they are able to defend themselves from the parakeets. And there is no EU campaign against the parakeet, although there are several trials, but no parrot species was listed on the EU invasive species list. Just to talk a bit, just to mention, in the parrot phylogenetic tree, Psittacula is here, and Psittacula includes those two genera, which makes Psittacula not monophyletic. So we split up Psittacula to that one, which makes the ringed parakeet changing to Alexandrinus. And the ringed parakeet itself is also not monophyletic, but paraphyletic with the egoparakeet clustering inside, so which makes the ringed parakeet two species, the African versus the Asian, and changing the name from Psittacula crameri to Alexandrinus meninensis. They are two species, but they are really two species because the African male is interested in the Asian female. She is not interested in him, but only in the Asian male. He, well, takes what is left over, like the monk parakeet. And I want to say thank you very much for your attention.
So I want to ask about the rapid evolution.
Yeah.
How do you separate the selection pressure from the founder effect?
Well, but the founder effect is that you have only few individuals, but the genetic set of these populations in Europe is more or less the same. They come out from the northeastern part of India. So there's not big genetic difference, but you can see that there's a difference in the morphology. So there was she did that. She was measuring all their beaks.
Thank you very much. Astrid Anderson is our next speaker on the wildlife trade from
Hi everyone, I'm Astrid. I'm a PhD student at the University of Hong Kong and I'm studying wildlife trade and its implications on the conservation of yellow-crested cockatoos. The yellow-crested cockatoo, Cacatoa sulfurea, has 7 described subspecies and its native range is the eastern side of the Wallace's Line, so the Lesser Sundas in Indonesia and Sulawesi Island. They are currently critically endangered and listed on CITES Appendix 1 since 2005. And this is because in the 80s and 90s, they were a hugely popular cage bird with over 75,600 exported from Indonesia alone. There are now, experts estimate, about 2,000 left in the native range. So as I mentioned, major threats include pet trade. This picture went all over media in 2015. It was a case involving 23 yellow-crested cockatoos smuggled in plastic bottles, because now you're only allowed to trade captive-bred yellow-crested cockatoos, and wild ones, presumably like what these were, are not allowed for international trade since the CITES uplisting in 2005. And another major threat, as with many endangered species, is habitat loss, especially in the Indonesian region where that is happening at a very rapid pace. So this double-edged sword. You have seen that wildlife trade is negatively affecting yellow-crested cockatoos in a massive way, but conversely, it's also transported them to urban centers where it almost acts like a safe haven species, and they've been doing, in Hong Kong at least, relatively well, and it kind of provides a reservoir for this species to continue and persist. So the Hong Kong population is currently at about 150 individuals, and their distribution is, I really should have mapped them against the like housing density rather than forest density, because they're found in the most built up financial heart of Hong Kong, as you can see on the range map there. And the population trend has been increasing since the first record in 1964. Although they were introduced before that, we have relied on records from Hong Kong Birdwatching Society to produce this population trend map, because we're very lucky to have had these professional ornithologists in Hong Kong throughout that time, recording all the different birds that they see and where they see them. So we took that data, collated it, and basically if there were more than 5 unique records and 5 unique locations in a year, we took that as a reliable population estimate. There's also an introduced population in Singapore, which is interesting because, well, earlier, like in the 60s and 70s, anecdotally, there is thought to have been a large and substantial population there. However, in the survey I did earlier this year, I only found 4 individuals. And we did the same thing with records from the Nature Society Singapore. We basically collated any records from their Singapore Avifauna Journal on yellow-crested cockatoos and found that since 1986, when the first issue of Singapore Avifauna was published, there has only been under 12 individuals in Singapore, and it's been steadily decreasing, as you would expect with the population that size. The largest native population of yellow-crested cockatoos is found in Komodo National Park, where there are approximately 680 individuals. As you can see, their population is doing relatively well in the past few years, since 2010, when the rangers started doing annual roost counts. And before that, it was less stable, according to the two academic studies that were done there in 2000 and 2005. So yeah, we have these different population trends going on in these three populations, and we hypothesized that that could be for three different reasons, including the availability of suitable habitat, how much competition there is with other large-bodied nest holders, and the continued threat of illegal trade. So to investigate the first hypothesis, we had to do get a baseline of suitable habitat or ideal habitat for the yellow-crested cockatoo. There's been very little ecological studies on this species because it's in quite a remote region of Indonesia. So we went there and did 37 transects in both yellow-crested cockatoo habitat and non-yellow-crested cockatoo habitat, measuring things like elevation, density of people, predators, trees, and also tree diversity. And we found that 30 species of tree were very common in the yellow-crested cockatoo habitat. And to expand on this, we're also going to replicate this study in Hong Kong and in Singapore to see if there are similar levels of elevation and predator density and tree species in those habitats, and where that is and how much of that there is. In Hong Kong, there's been one study before on the relationship between large trees and cockatoo density or cockatoo distribution, and it found that there was a very strong correlation between those two. And from my observations in the field, this is a list of the trees that yellow-crested cockatoos use to either feed, roost, or nest in. And they are actually 77.5 of them are ornamental, exotic, introduced trees, which is interesting and may explain why they're sort of restricted to the urban areas and the urban parks they're in. And also, it highlighted in orange, you can see that almost 30% of the species they use are actually of Australasian origin. So similar to the dry Wallacean habitats that they inhabit in their native range. In terms of competition, there are two other large hole nesters in Singapore. There's one other cockatoo species and there's one hornbill species as well. Whereas in Hong Kong and Komodo, there are no other cockatoo species or hornbill species. So in Singapore, we did the same thing that we did for the yellow-crested cockatoo records from Nature Society Singapore. We also went back and looked at any records of the Goffin's cockatoo and oriental pied hornbill. And we found that their distribution is basically exactly the same as you can see on the range map here. And in terms of population trends, the blue line is what you saw earlier with the yellow-crested cockatoos, very low, decreasing. The Goffin's cockatoo has been more unstable and fluctuating, but at a generally higher abundance than the yellow-crested cockatoo. And for the hornbills that have recently recolonized Singapore since 1998 or thereabouts, there has been a huge increase. And when I was doing my survey there, I observed a lot of competition around nest holes, particularly between the Goffin's cockatoo and the oriental pied hornbill, which are both quite aggressive species. There's a video here. I don't think I have time to show it to you now, but if anyone wants to see it later, I can show you. Yeah. So the third aspect of our hypothesis is illegal trade. How much of a continued threat is it to these species in these locations? In Komodo National Park, we thought that perhaps this was the reason for the 2005 dip in population. So to investigate that, we interviewed rangers and villagers in Komodo National Park about the population trends over time and their perceived threats to yellow-crested cockatoos. And the results actually showed that there was a general agreement that yellow-crested cockatoo populations have been stable since 1980, and that poaching activity is very low and almost non-existent in the national park. The rangers thought that trapping was the second least important factor out of 6 that influenced the yellow-crested cockatoos, whereas villagers thought that it was the least important. And they both listed big trees as a relatively important factor to their persistence, which is interesting to our other hypothesis about habitat availability. In Hong Kong, meanwhile, we looked into the trade figures from CITES, which said that there have been 10 captive-bred yellow-crested cockatoos imported since 2005, so the last 13 years, just 10 imported. However, our market survey that we've been doing for about a year and a half now has found 37 unique individuals of yellow-crested cockatoos for trade since January 2017. So that led us to ask the question, where is this surplus supply of yellow-crested cockatoos coming from? It could be that there are amateur home breeders at home, that are breeding cockatoos, or there have been at least 2 recorded incidences of hole poaching in Hong Kong, where people go and grab the chicks out of the nest hole, even though it's a highly urbanized area and it's broad daylight, as you can see in that photo. I guess it still happens, and you would, because the yellow-crested cockatoos sell for about $2,000 US, and if you get 100% profit on that, it makes sense, I suppose. But yeah, so what we've done is we've taken feathers from below the roosting sites in Hong Kong for the population, the feral population, and we've also got feathers from captive yellow-crested cockatoos, so from pet owners or rehabilitation centers, SPCA, that kind of thing. And we've tested the stable isotope ratios relating to diet. So that would be carbon, because basically the captive cockatoos feed on bird feed, sort of pet food that is mostly made up of agricultural means, whereas the wild cockatoos feed on what they would in the wild, like flowers, leaves, that sort of thing. And those produce a significantly different carbon ratio signature. And also, as you can see in the figure, they are significantly different in nitrogen ratios also. So it's a forensic tool that enforcement could use to check the market if they see any yellow-crested cockatoos, take some feather samples and test if it's been recently feeding on a diet that is more similar to a wild cockatoo diet instead of a captive cockatoo diet. And going forward, I'm only 2 years through my PhD, so things can always change and things always are, but at the moment we're thinking to refine this stable isotope analysis tool. We're also hoping to replicate the interviews in Hong Kong to find out more about, how people feel about them, their attitudes toward this introduced population they have there, the persistence of poaching potentially also. And we, as I mentioned, want to replicate the habitat availability transects in both Hong Kong and Singapore, and maybe also use GIS to kind of map how much suitable habitat there even is for them to expand into. And we want to also quantify and measure the competition going on in Singapore and Hong Kong. I'd just like to thank all the organizations and individuals that have supported me, particularly Caroline Dingle, Luke Gibson, and Jess Lee over there, and all the rangers in Komodo National Park.
In Hong Kong, poaching
Singapore, what happens to any yellow-crested cockatoos that are either confiscated or brought into rehab centers? Is there a captive breeding program where they release back into their non-native habitat?
It doesn't happen that often. Normally, if they're brought in, they're normally dead, I think, fallen from the nest or something like that. But there have been a few injuries recently, and those have been brought to a rehabilitation center where they are at the moment rehabilitating them. I don't know if they're planning to re-release them or not, but I guess if they got a lot of them, that's something that they would have to consider. The Hong Kong government has sort of mixed attitudes toward the introduced population of yellow-crested cockatoos. They, on the one hand, recognize that they are a critically endangered species, but they also are very noisy. They're in the financial district, as I mentioned, and they can cause quite a lot of damage, both to trees, but also economic damage to buildings and housing and so on. So, yeah, it's a tricky situation.
Are you also checking the genetics of these populations to know where they come from?
Well, we plan to, because we've been contacting different museums for samples of the original, the native Indonesian population. As you saw, it's fragmented over a lot of islands and includes 7 subspecies. So we first need to profile those 7 subspecies, and then we can test and track ones in Hong Kong. Not sure how I feel about that. It's going to be a bit difficult, I think, and test them as well to see which subpopulation they belong to. I think that would be very interesting.
You can use feathers.
But you have to have the blood clot at the bottom. Just kind of. We can talk about that afterwards, maybe. Yeah.
Sorry, was the nitrogen driven analysis done on feathers or pieces?
It was done on feathers, yeah. So I did speed through that a bit, but we basically collected feathers from below roosting sites in the wild habitat and from captive individuals in rehabilitation centers and so on.
So if a wild bird goes into captivity, will carbon nitrogen ratio change the next one molt, or will it change more quickly?
Yeah, it depends on the molting cycle. So in the feather, it's a bit like in our hair, if we consume like vegetarians and carnivores, for example, if you change to a vegetarian diet, you would be able to track it along the growth of your hair. But when we lose that hair, we lose that information. So the future plan is to work with this species of cockatoo and try and track, maybe with the rehabilitated individuals I was talking about earlier, track their molting pattern and how long it is. In most species of cockatoo, I believe it's about 6 months, unless they get very stressed. But you could overcome that stress issue if you took other samples across the body. But yeah, we have some refining to do on that tool. But at the moment, it looks like there's about a 6-month window.
Well, to some extent, if it was used for forensic purposes, it's better to last a few months, right?
Yeah.
If you caught a bird from the wild and we're transporting it and still have the same carbon nitrogen ratio of a wild bird, that would last.
Yeah. Great.
Great, thank you very much. My clock's supposed to start in 3 minutes, so I'm not entirely sure whether I should wait for it.
She has a lot of
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's see. Brooke Durham from Southern California Parrots is our next speaker.
Just enough of a pause where you think it's done, and then you start talking and nobody. Okay, can you guys hear me okay? Good. All right, so I'm going to talk to you about our SoCal Parrots, so I will use that name because I get tongue-tied with Southern California stuff. So the reason that I identified our rehabilitation program, which is what we do, as Southern California, and I wanted to narrow it down to just Southern California, is because we do not work with the Telegraph Hill Parrots or anything up in the Bay Area. So San Francisco, none of that. We do work with Mickaboo, who is the organization that takes care of those birds. So we're in communication with them, but they have an established program there, so we don't move into their territory. Also, on top of that, we already sometimes spend 8 hours a day driving to LA and back to pick up birds. So no way we can add San Francisco into that. So I am the founder and director of SoCal Parrot and SoCal Wildlife. I'm also on the board for the International Wildlife Rehabilitation Council. So I kind of am here today not as an academic, but more as a wildlife rehabilitator who's trying to point out to you guys as academics that you need to be working with your wildlife rehab friends. There's a lot of data that we can very easily collect in the process of what we do that you guys could do a lot of work with, and just by analyzing the data alone, not having to handle the birds, which is handy when you work with hookbills. So I want to talk to you a little bit about this word, and Roland mentioned it earlier, and I stole it from him. So I think you probably stole it from someone else, right? Yeah. So unless you guys, probably you don't know what this is, but of course, xenophobia is the fear of something that is new. And so eco-xenophobia is something new in your ecology or your environment. So what it basically means is the idea that we're making judgments that are not objectively supported through science. And what I find is that this is a very common thing with our naturalized parrots. There is a bias, even among scientists and especially among ornithologists, that these birds must be bad because they're not supposed to be here, right? But that's not an objective. That's very biased opinion to come into it with. So very good. Excellent. I always need the goals on my side. So I know that you guys are a group that pride yourself on not showing bias, but I would like to point out that this is a very common thing that we run into when we work with naturalized parrots. And I'm very happy to be here as a representative of our parrots because I think it's important that we start to change our minds about urban areas and what they offer to our species that we're losing across the globe, especially in the pseudocyforms. So I have to always include a lot of stuff. I like to make fun of myself, and I love this picture of the little girl with a budgie on her head being terrified. Actually, what's funny is this is exactly what my mom looks like when she's in my house every day because she is terrified of birds, which is, there's got to be some psychological issue that went into birds when she's afraid of them. So a lot of people know me as the parrot girl in Southern California because every time there's an issue with a parrot, I'm on TV and I'm the dread hit girl, so everybody recognizes me. And I think that this is what they think I am. Like I just sit around staring at my parrots and saying, I love you and I only love you, parrots. But the truth is, I actually am a wildlife rehabilitator. I was first in raptors and then songbirds. And now I run my whole organization and we're permitted for all species in California. So just to reinforce, obviously how much I love raptors, because look at the color combination on that parrot, and then check out my hair right there. See, I like to be in vogue with my compadres. So this is a photo of an Amazon, a wild red-crowned Amazon, which is an endangered, CITES endangered bird. That was, I will kindly call, denested by a crow. This one was lucky enough to fall at the feet of some people that were at the beach that day. So the crow lost his meal, and this little girl showed up with us. Now, when this would happen prior to my founding the organization that I run, These birds had two options when they would come into a wildlife rehabilitation center. First option was somebody take this thing home. It's a dang parrot. We don't want it. We don't want a parrot program. We don't even know what to do with this. Someone take it home. Now, keep in mind that this was at the same time in 2008 and 9 when the economy had collapsed. Housing was an issue, especially in California, as it always is. And you could not get a house where you could keep a parrot. So all of the domestic parrot places were completely inundated and every one of them in Southern California had a moratorium on accepting any more additional parrots. So these parrots had nowhere to go at all. So the other option was to ice the birds, and I saw that happen a lot. And then one day I kind of thought, these are wild birds, and for some reason I think it's kind of crazy that we're euthanizing baby wild red-crowned Amazons, which are now endangered, when they clearly are doing well here. So I started to look into that, and it didn't settle well with me. So as I dug in, I realized we've got some serious problems with these birds, right? And so 38% endangered due to human activity. This is a little red-crowned conure, red masked conure, and he is also now near threatened. So a lot of our species are really in decline. So if you want to know what we have in Southern California, just chew on this for a minute. We have a lot of species, and we have several that are really important from a conservation standpoint. Now, my data comes from down here at the bottom. You're going to see Garrett, Mab, Kristen Messick, California Phlox, and of course IUCN. So the reason that this palm tree is on here, and if you see my logo for the organization, there are palm trees on it. And the reason is that's a very important portion of our program. Oops, sorry guys. I obviously hit the wrong button. Okay. So my question then became, how do we use the birds we have to help the birds that we're probably going to lose? Well, we needed to get the blessing. Because I am a licensed, permitted wildlife rehabilitator, I have to walk very finely on the line of keeping, these agencies happy with what I'm doing. And I know I can't step on their toes, so I needed to get their blessing before I began to release these birds. So we contacted them on multiple occasions, trying to get feedback as we had a flight full of Amazons that were ready to be let go, but I refused to let them go until I heard back. And it went on and on and on for a couple of years, no response. So funny thing, an ironic thing happened when another rehabber who doesn't like how I do things put a complaint in to these organizations saying, or to the agency saying they're releasing birds and they're not allowed to do that. And the nice thing about that is in the US, they have to respond to you if you're a citizen. So they had to do an inquiry. They had to force it to the biologists. And so we finally got our answer, which was, do it. We don't care. They're not a problem. So we had to develop a rescue, rehab, and release protocol. We wanted to make sure we covered ourselves and could prove that if any sort of, avian zoonotic diseases showed up in the community, they weren't coming from our birds as we released them. And then we also wanted to be a little forward thinking and microchip and start collecting as much data as possible. So that little incident with the member of the public who didn't like me, who turned me in, got this to happen. Thank you, whoever that was. So CDFW and US Fish and Wildlife came back and said, these birds are not invasive. They're contained to only, certain areas, and they're not going out into our native scrub, which is true. And thanks especially to Kristen Messick, who released this awesome Maxent model, which showed that our parrots can only survive in a very small section of San Diego County. And this is common. We cover about 7 or 8 counties in Southern California, but this happens in every county. It's basically the same thing. The coastal areas that are older, that have mature trees, that's where the birds can exist. So we're going to check that bias right now, right? And we're going to say native doesn't always mean invasive. So just a reminder of what wildlife rehabilitation is. We want to treat and care for injured, diseased, and displaced animals, and then release healthy animals into appropriate habitats. So the first year at our very first release, and for some reason Audubon chose the conure for all the photos, but there were a lot of Amazons. This was sort of our little coming out party. We hit the ground running with this article, and we started to get a lot of recognition. And I really want to thank Audubon for talking me into this, because I was a little bit hesitant to do it, but we made it work. So we wanted to test for psittacosis and other diseases that are associated with parrots. And so some sort of arbitrary information that an informal poll of veterinarians who have accepted these wild parrots to treat, just out of the goodness of their heart over the years, since the 1950s and 60s even, have shown that they have never had a positive psittacosis test. Now, I can't get all the guys that are retired now who I've spoken to go back through their records and give me that for actual hard data. But I can tell you what our tests have come back as since we started accepting birds in 2012, and we've had 0 positives. We test for everything, by the way, all the parrot stuff, and occasionally we throw in just an entire, test them for everything you've got kind of thing, just to make sure. So we're also in preliminary talks with UC Davis for a formal study on their possible resistance to psittacosis, because we know it shows up in other species in our wild communities in Southern California. So we know that they're exposed to it, and theoretically they should be able to get it, but for some reason they do not. So we also microchip and collect tons of data. We've had significantly less bleeding issues since we switched to the nanochips. Bleeding, of course, typically we would have that problem in some of our smaller conures, because that larger chip was just a bit big. And typically we're microchipping babies that have come in that year before they go into our fly cages, because they have to have a clean bill of health before they're allowed in that environment. So they don't have a lot of fat or a lot of muscle to put the chip into. So we were having some bleeding issues. Once we switched to the nano chips, no problem. And by the way, you guys, if you haven't checked lately, you can get nano chips for about $5 each. Really cheap tool. You may even be able to get them cheaper than that if you're doing a study and ordering in bulk. We only order 50 at a time. So. And then about this time last year, we were contacted by Moore Lab, which is located up in the Los Angeles area, Pasadena, where there are a lot of parrots. Probably the highest density of our wild parrots are in that region. And what had happened, it was kind of interesting how it all worked out. A lilac-crowned Amazon had flown into the museum building where their bird collection is. It died under the window. And the guy comes, the collection manager comes out and goes, we're going to stuff this bird, keep it in our collection. And he started looking at them and looking at the old specimens they have. And conveniently, that bird really did us all a favor, because that particular Moore Lab has the largest collection of Mexican species from prior to 1950. So really good set of birds to do a genome on. So they contacted us and they said, is there any way we can have your bodies? I happily sent them to them because I had been begging the guys that around San Diego to take them and stuff them. And they had been, but they weren't like trying to do anything with them. So we started sending our bodies up there and they started stuffing them. And so you can see here that we have what appear to be two red crown, one lilac crown, some sort of probably yellow head. It's hard to tell when they're young, right? So this is just an idea of what our release rate is right now. And of course, our very important Amazons that we're working with, the red crown and the lilac crown, which are most common, are actually the ones that are being the most released. I question a 40% release rate. I want it to be higher, but it's significantly higher than other rehabilitation organizations. So most of the birds, this also includes the year that we had someone shooting conures in our area with pellet guns. So we got in about 20 bodies that were probably shot with a pellet gun. So that jumped our numbers of dead up or non-releasables. So these are our two endangered Mexican species that we have ubiquitously in San Diego. We definitely have a lot of red-crowned Amazons. We have some lilac-crowned Amazons, and so one of the questions, of course, is are they hybridizing? And I can see, yes, definitely they are hybridizing. How far they're hybridizing or how often, that was the question we couldn't answer without Occidental's genome study on their original specimens from Mexico. So these dates, if you'll notice, are pretty long ago. We don't have accurate counts on what's going on in Mexico. And unfortunately, it's not really a situation that we can get in there and really get accurate counts on at this point in time. So we kind of have to operate on the assumption that we have more species or more higher numbers in Southern California of these species than are left in their native environment. At least almost certainly with the red crown. The lilac crown is questionable how many we have. So just a nice shot of a red crown there with a lilac crown. Obviously, they're tolerant of each other, but they both retain their native, costume. So a nice thing happened a few years ago when the red-crowned Amazon was declared to be naturally occurring in Texas. Texas Parks and Wildlife gave a grant to Texas A&M, Donald Brightsmith, to oversee sort of a program to figure out how we can hold on to those birds in Texas and help them get along. And I also want to give a shout out to the Rio Grande Valley Birding Festival because they love red-crowned Amazons and they do a great job of keeping the public interested in doing roost counts for the scientists and citizen science, all that stuff. So could the SoCal parrots serve as a genetic reservoir for Texas? Because there are some interesting things going on these days that sometimes we're not allowed to talk about in the US, but I'm not affiliated with any government funding, so I can say whatever I want. Last year at this time with IWRC, with my rehab group, I was in the middle of trying to get relief into these areas for our associated wildlife rehabilitators because we had an unfortunate second bloom of ground squirrels at the same time that we had massive flooding in Houston. So we had rehabbers on islands. They would be in a subdivision on an island and no way to get anything to them other than, a boat. So I want to point out that this really imperiled a lot of our parrot species throughout the Caribbean, this 1 month period. And if you look at this little beauty and the way it came into Houston and it sat out right off the coast and it just pumped water onto the land for like 3 days. It was just nonstop. If that storm had moved 100 miles south, oops, right here, this is where the remaining population of about 1,000 birds is in Texas. We would have seen the same defoliation issues that we saw in Puerto Rican Amazon, where the El Yunque Reserve, where there were about 40 birds they had bred and put out into the wild and they were doing well, disappeared after this storm went through. So the important thing to point out is, can our birds in Southern California serve as our genetic reservoir for that situation, or we can move them back in? So I will also want to point out at this point that wild parrots have no protections in the state of California. You could debate whether or not they are protected by cruelty laws, but as of yet, I've handed full cases that are worked up and preserved, ready to prosecute to some of our cruelty officers, and they haven't been willing to do anything with that information. So that kind of brings us to where we are, and we're continuing to build on our progress. We do want to gain local protections for the parrots in Southern California, much like they did in Texas, where they just kind of slowly began to, say the citizens said we want to protect it in this municipality, and it spread to the next municipality, and it went on like that. And the nice thing about that would be that when we do find these poaching situations that pop up on Facebook or something like that, we would actually have some teeth behind our threats. We also want to assist with the conservation of any and all citizens. So if you guys are doing studies or you're interested, we're happy to collect those samples for you. Again, it's very little field work for you because we're getting birds in from all over Southern California. We also want to provide those samples and biometric data, and we will be accepting wildlife rehab and research interns at the end of, middle of next year. We're building a new facility. So this is sort of the last slide that I added in at the last minute because we don't have the papers produced yet, but there is a roost count paper coming from San Diego County at Western Ornithologists in the U.S. In September, I believe. And then genetic analysis of SoCal's Amazonas with more lab. And I can tell you that I only got a really brief email back from the researcher because, of course, this data was supposed to be released in December, and then March, and then April, and then May, and then, and I kept just getting a screenshot of in progress, kind of thing. And I got it. I got one line back from him which said, you sent me 4 lilac-crowned Amazons. 2 of them were F1s, so they were 50-50, but they appeared to be lilac. A handful of them were mostly red-crowned with some lilac in there, and the rest were pure wild genome. So the answer is yes. We can definitely think about doing a test on the birds when they come in and sending them to Texas if we need to. We can't send them to Mexico without a lot of birds. So that's it. These are the ways you guys can follow us and what we're doing. Thank God baby season is now wrapping up because normally you can watch we do Facebook Live feedings with the babies, and I look like I've been in a dryer being tumbled at that time. But our numbers are very high this year. I'm happy to say we thought we were going to plateau on numbers, and we're looking like we're going to exceed by about 50 birds. So populations are increasing, and that's it.
Thank you. Thank you all for participating. If you have any questions, or everyone can speak, or if you have any questions, hang out.
What is the number of the gray-crowned Amazon? Because you say it's higher than the Mexican population, so it's more than 3,000.
Yeah, we have one major roof site in San Diego County, and the numbers look like they're approaching 1,000 at that one roof site in Lloyd County now at 7. So I suspect that there will probably be twice that number, if not more, in Pasadena. So I think it's easy to assume that there are 3,000 or more red crown end zones in Southern California.
How does that to be made?
I just want, the one in San Diego is wrapping up. She just hasn't produced the paper yet, but that's gonna be official any day now. Yeah.